Rustbringer, Chapter 1. The Green Lung. The rain in the Copper Lung Valley wasn't water. It was a slick, viscous green, born of the valley's own affliction, the insidious oxidation that gnawed at everything, transforming iron to brittle rust and steel to weeping decay. It clung to the moss-drenched stones of the crumbling villages, coated the skeletal branches of the ironwood trees, and settled in the oily sheen of the steam-powered machinery that constituted the Shogun's grotesque dominion. It tasted of regret, and the slow, agonizing death of metal. I was known as Rai, though the name felt like a mockery, a polished surface clinging desperately to the corroding core of my being. They called me the Rustbringer, a moniker whispered with a mixture of fear and a strange, reluctant respect. It wasn't a title earned through valor or martial prowess. It was one etched onto me by a sickness, a parasitic intrusion that had hollowed out my lungs and turned me into a living engine of destruction. I moved through the clinging mist with a deliberate slowness, the indigo of my kimono a bruised shadow against the pervasive green. It wasn't a fine silk, but a coarse, treated hemp, patched with scraps of leather and reinforced with riveted steel plates, a grim acknowledgement of the vulnerability I possessed. My boots, worn and scarred, sank slightly into the ferrous soil, each step kicking up a miniature cloud of gray dust, another testament to the valley's relentless consumption. My breath, or rather the lack of it, was a constant, chilling reminder. I didn't inhale. I exhaled. A thick, black vapor, acrid and suffocating, poured from my throat, a corrosive exhale that aged metal with terrifying speed. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, a miniature apocalypse contained within a man. I wasn't seeking glory, nor vengeance. I was merely passing through. A ghost, adrift in a world drowning in gears and steam. My purpose, if you could call it that, was to disrupt, to unravel, to be the slow, silent undoing of a nightmare. Ahead, the silhouette of the citadel of the iron cog rose against the bruised sky, a monstrous structure of blackened steel, gears grinding like the teeth of a dying beast, and pipes spewing high-pressure steam. This was the domain of the Clockwork Shogun, a tyrannical figure who ruled through a system of steam slavery, replacing the lungs of free men and women with brass bellows that relentlessly pumped, driving them to exhaustion, and ultimately, death. The Shogun wasn't a man of flesh and blood, but a meticulously crafted automaton, a cage of spinning gold wheels and interlocking cogs, a monument to the triumph of cold, calculated control. I'd been tracking him for weeks, following the trail of decaying metal and panicked whispers. The villagers, reduced to pale, twitching automatons, had begun to show the faintest flicker of awareness, a dull recognition of their stolen lives. They were ghosts, too, lingering on the edges of the Shogun's control, ripe for the touch of the rust. Suddenly, a faint skittering sound broke the oppressive silence. I froze, my senses acutely focused. Tetsu, Payuna. Tetsu was unexpected. A small, furious thing, no larger than a badger, but undeniably intelligent. He was a grease thief, a failed experiment, a rat with fur composed of interwoven steel wires and eyes that burned with a cold, amber light. He could smell the subtle friction in a machine's joints, identify its weak points with unsettling accuracy. He was, in essence, a miniature sabotage device. The Clockwork Shogun's engineers had abandoned him, deeming him too unpredictable, too destructive. Now, he was my companion, my secret weapon. Haze locating a pressure valve in the eastern quadrant, Tetsu squeaked. His voice a high-pitched whine barely audible above the grinding gears. He was clinging to my kimono sleeve, his tiny steel claws meticulously tracing the fabric. The steam slavery units in that sector are prone to overheating. A well-placed disruption would optimize the situation. I didn't correct his phrasing. Tetsu's pragmatic, almost brutal, efficiency was a necessary counterpoint to my own, increasingly sluggish existence. Let's proceed, I rasped, the word a harsh expulsion of the corrosive vapor that clung to my throat. As we approached the citadel, the defenses became more apparent. Piston guards, towering warriors encased in hydraulic rams, their limbs capable of shearing through stone. They moved with a terrifying, unnatural fluidity, their steam-venting armor hissing with lethal pressure. They were, in the Shogun's warped logic, the ultimate expression of order, perfectly regulated, relentlessly efficient, and utterly devoid of humanity. The first piston guard, a hulking brute of polished brass and blackened steel, advanced with a menacing grunt. I remained motionless, my hand instinctively gripping Oxidizer, the katana forged of porous volcanic glass. As the hydraulic fist swung, I exhaled. The black rust vapor enveloped the guard's joints, and the effect was instantaneous. The brass groaned, shuddered, and seized. The internal mechanisms locked, grinding to a halt with a sickening screech. The piston jammed, and the guard crumpled to the ground, a rusting ruin of expensive metal. Tetsu darted forward, disappearing into the swirling steam. A moment later, a sharp, high-pitched squeal pierced the air, followed by the explosive hiss of escaping steam. The guard's armor, once gleaming, was now riddled with holes, venting its lethal contents into the valley. The sound was a promise, a chilling articulation of my purpose. I was the Rustbringer, and this was the beginning of the end. The silence that followed the piston guard's demise was almost as unsettling as the initial chaos. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of corroded brass, mingled with the faint, sickly sweetness of burnt oil. The remaining piston guards, alerted by the guard's sudden collapse, shifted their attention to us, their hydraulic limbs whirring with unsettling precision. They weren't simply reacting, they were calculating, their internal processors undoubtedly assessing the threat. I adjusted my stance, the rough indigo of my kimono clinging to me like a shroud. Rai wasn't a warrior seeking glory, he was a predator, conserving energy, acutely aware that every breath, every movement, was a drain on his dwindling condition. Tetsu, a miniature storm of steel wire, scurried across my sleeve, his amber eyes scanning the machinery of the nearest guard. He emitted a series of rapid clicks, a language of friction and strain, translating the guard's internal workings into a tactical assessment. "Pressure .73, Tetsu squeaked, his voice a high-pitched whine. "Central hydraulic actuator. Vulnerable to localized corrosion." I nodded, barely perceptible. This wasn't a dance of swordsmanship, it was a cold, surgical dismantling. I extended my arm, channeling the Void-Canker, and exhaled. The black vapor billowed forth, thicker this time, deliberately focused. It wasn't a wide sweeping attack, it was a concentrated burn. The second guard, a leaner model with articulated legs designed for rapid traversal, was caught completely by surprise. The vapor slammed into its midsection, targeting the joint connecting its thigh to its torso. The metal screamed in protest as the corrosion ate away at the reinforced alloys. Unlike the first guard, this one didn't simply seize, it spasmed violently, its hydraulic limbs flailing wildly as the internal pressure fought against the relentless decay. "Overload!" Tetsu shrieked, darting between the guard's legs, embedding himself within the exposed gears of its lower leg. The rat began to vibrate furiously, rubbing his steel fur against the critical mechanisms, creating a grinding, interlocking effect. The guard's movements became erratic, jerky, a horrifying parody of coordinated action. I followed through with Oxidizer, a single, precise stroke. The katana, already slick with corrosive acid, sliced through the weakened joint, severing the hydraulic lines. A geyser of high-pressure steam erupted, instantly vaporizing the guard's lower leg. The remaining limb jerked spasmodically before collapsing in a heap of twisted brass and ruined hydraulics. The Shogun's forces were methodical, almost clinical. They understood the threat, not the warrior before them, but the principle of decay itself. Each guard was equipped with rudimentary sensors, designed to detect anomalies in their own mechanisms, triggering a localized release of steam to suppress any signs of corrosion. We were effectively fighting a machine fighting itself. As we moved deeper into the citadel, the architecture shifted. The walls were constructed not of stone, but of interlocking plates of hardened steel, a labyrinthine defense designed to disrupt any direct assault. The air grew heavier, the green haze of oxidation more intense, a testament to the Shogun's relentless application of steam and corrupted metal. Suddenly, a volley of steam hissed from the walls, erupting in a localized storm of scalding vapor. We were momentarily blinded, thrown off balance. The smell of burnt flesh and ozone filled the air. "Warning!" Tetsu shrieked, scrambling up my sleeve. "Pressure surge in the corridor's thermal regulators. They're venting." I reacted instinctively, raising Oxidizer, channeling the Void-Canker with a desperate, almost reckless surge. The black vapor, now a torrent, ripped through the steam vents, consuming the regulators in a cascade of corrosive destruction. The steam ceased abruptly, replaced by a ringing silence and the unmistakable scent of molten metal. But our actions hadn't gone unnoticed. From the depths of the citadel, a rhythmic thumping began, growing steadily louder. It wasn't the clank of hydraulic limbs, but a deeper, more resonant vibration, the sound of gears turning, of a massive machine waking. Rounding a corner, we found ourselves facing a colossal automaton, a steel hound, a beast of polished steel and whirling blades, designed for close-quarters combat. It was roughly the size of a warhorse, its head a rotating sphere bristling with razor-sharp blades, its legs terminating in spiked pistons. The steel hound's amber eyes, twin points of malevolent light, locked onto us. "Its primary drive chain is heavily oiled," Tetsu reported, his amber eyes flickering with urgency. "Lubrication is its defense. We need to disrupt that flow." I didn't need to be told twice. This wasn't a confrontation, it was an annihilation. The air grew cold, and I felt the Void-Canker consuming me with frightening speed. This was the true price of our cause. Chapter 3. The serpents coil. The steel hound charged, a furious blur of polished steel and predatory intent. Its initial attack was a brutal, grinding lunge, the spiked pistons of its legs slamming into the stone floor with enough force to send tremors through the citadel. I reacted with a speed born of desperation, a chaotic dance of movement dictated by the expanding tendrils of the Void-Canker within me. Oxidizer moved, a black blade against a metallic storm, slicing through the air as the hound's first piston slammed into the wall inches from my chest. The impact resonated, a jarring clang that momentarily masked Tetsu's frantic warnings. "Its left leg! The lubrication port is exposed! A direct hit!" I pivoted, utilizing the momentary distraction, and unleashed a concentrated exhale. The black vapor coalesced into a dense, suffocating cloud, targeting the hound's left leg with terrifying precision. The steel hissed and warped, the lubricating oil instantly turning to a viscous, bubbling sludge. The hound stumbled, its movement momentarily disrupted, the polished surface of its leg buckling under the corrosive assault. But the steel hound was not a creature of finesse. It roared, a guttural grinding of gears and compressed steam, and retaliated with a whirlwind of blades. The rotating sphere of its head spun with dizzying speed, each razor-sharp edge a potential death sentence. I deflected the first onslaught with Oxidizer, a desperate, almost instinctive parry that left a streak of black acid on the blade's surface. The steel hissed and crumbled under the touch, a testament to the Void-Canker's relentless power. Tetsu, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of frantic motion, a tiny buzzing shadow within the chaos. He darted across the hound's flank, disappearing into the gaps between its articulated plates. I felt the prickle of his steel fur against my skin as he skillfully manipulated the lubricant seals, introducing minuscule, strategically placed shards of volcanic glass, the same material that formed the core of Oxidizer, into the joints. Each shard, barely visible, acted like a microscopic saw, accelerating the corrosion process, turning vital mechanisms into brittle ruin. Pressure building in the gate actuators. Tetsu shrieked, his amber eyes glowing brighter with each successful intervention. It's compensating. A counterattack is imminent. The hound, enraged by the relentless assault, unleashed a torrent of steam from its articulated jaws, a searing blast that forced me to shield my face. The air crackled with heat, and I tasted the metallic tang of burning flesh. I staggered back, momentarily disoriented, and realized the hound was focusing its attack, relentlessly targeting the vulnerable joints of my arm. A hydraulic fist, polished to a mirror sheen, slammed into my forearm, driving me against a reinforced section of the citadel wall. Pain exploded through my body, a searing, agonizing wave. I grunted, attempting to rise, but the hound seized the opportunity, locking its jaws around my wrist, its metallic teeth biting into the flesh. Just as I felt myself losing consciousness, a high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by a shuddering vibration. Tetsu, with a feat of impossible agility, had located the core of the hound's drive system, a delicate, pressure-regulated pump, and using his steel fur, had introduced a quantity of fine, powdered rust, harvested from the accumulated decay of countless machines within the citadel. The pump seized. The hound's movements stuttered, its rotations becoming erratic, its piston legs locking in place with a jarring metallic groan. The machine shuddered, a dying beast, its relentless assault abruptly halted. I seized the opportunity, drawing Oxidizer in a fluid motion, channeling the Void-Canker to its fullest extent. The black vapor, now a roaring inferno, engulfed the hound's head, consuming the rotating blades, melting the gears within its skull, and leaving behind a residue of corroded, smoking metal. The beast shuddered violently, its amber eyes dimming, its final cry a strangled, grinding whimper. As the last vestiges of the steel hound dissolved into a swirling vortex of black ash, a new threat emerged. From the shadowed corridor, a figure appeared, a gear guardian, a towering automaton sculpted from interlocking brass plates and powered by a network of meticulously crafted clockwork mechanisms. Its face was a grim mask of polished metal, and its arms ended in immense claw-like appendages capable of crushing stone. "The Guardians are deployed," Tetsu hissed, his voice tight with urgency. "They patrol the Citadel's arteries. They are designed to eliminate anomalies." This was more than just a machine. This was a carefully calibrated instrument of death, a testament to the Shogun's obsessive control. It moved with unnerving precision, its gears whirring and clicking in a rhythmic, unsettling cadence. As it advanced, I felt the Void-Canker intensifying, responding to the urgency of the situation, feeding off the fear and the desperate need to survive. I knew with a chilling certainty that this encounter wouldn't be a simple battle of brute force. It would be a war of attrition, a slow, agonizing process of decay, a final, desperate act of defiance against a regime built on cold, unyielding steel. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Brass. The Gear Guardian's approach was a symphony of calculated menace. It didn't charge with the brutal hydraulic fury of the piston guards. Instead, it moved with a disturbingly fluid grace, a series of rotating plates, shifting and locking, its movements mirroring the Shogun's clockwork obsession. Each rotation of its brass torso was accompanied by the measured tick-tock of intricate gears, a constant, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to burrow into the bone. Tetsu, a frantic blur of steel wire fur, darted ahead, a tiny, desperate conductor of chaos. He burrowed into the joints of the Guardian's legs, injecting minuscule amounts of a potent, phosphorescent oil distilled from ancient, corrupted ironwood. This oil, a shimmering emerald green, wasn't designed to simply lubricate it, accelerated oxidation, turning the Guardian's meticulously engineered mechanisms into fragile, brittle traps. Rai, leaning against a crumbling pillar of blackened copper, watched with a detached, weary observation. The air around him shimmered with the sickly sweet scent of decay, a testament to his own existence. His movements were slow, deliberate, each exhale a calculated expenditure of his corrosive essence. He wasn't fighting, he was dismantling. "It's reacting," Tetsu squeaked, pulling back from a joint that now sputtered with a greenish froth. "The wood oil is feeding on its own structure. The Guardian is fighting the damage, but it's weakening itself." The Gear Guardian responded to the oil's insidious influence with an unsettling precision. Its left arm, a complex assembly of interlocking gears and articulated plating, began to seize, the rhythmic grinding of its movements stuttering into a jarring, irregular clang. Small sparks erupted from the joints as the accelerated oxidation consumed the brass. Rai, sensing the shift in momentum, rose. He moved with a surprising fluidity, considering his decaying state. His Oxidizer katana, a dark, pulsing shard of volcanic glass, seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. As the Guardian pivoted, attempting to bring its massive, claw-like hand down, Rai didn't evade. He simply became the target. He unleashed a torrent of black rust vapor, not a focused blast, but a continuous, suffocating wave. The vapor didn't just corrode, it seemed to unravel the very fabric of the Guardian's construction. The gears in its arm visibly warped, grinding against each other with a desperate, grinding scream. The polished brass plating bloomed with grotesque blossoming pustules of black rust, weakening the metal until it resembled crumbling charcoal. "Magnificent," Tetsu whispered, scrambling onto Rei's shoulder. "You're amplifying the effect. The Void-Canker, it's resonating with the internal stress." The Guardian retaliated, its movements becoming even more erratic. Its face mask whirred violently, attempting to expel the corrosive vapor with a series of miniature, brass bellows. But the bellows were choked with the oil Tetsu had introduced, creating a vicious feedback loop. The expelled steam, tainted with the emerald green oil, now accelerated the corrosion of the Guardian's own mechanisms. Suddenly, the Guardian's right arm, the arm Rai had targeted, exploded in a shower of fractured brass and shredded gears. The remaining segments of the arm, driven by the desperate failing mechanisms, flailed wildly, smashing into the citadel walls with devastating force. "It's losing control," Tetsu shrieked, dodging a whirling fragment of brass. "We need to break the central regulator." The central regulator, Rai realized, was the heart of the Guardian's command system, a massive, rotating gyroscope encased in a cage of intricately meshed gears. It was located within the Guardian's chest cavity, the point where the Shogun's clockwork influence reached its apex. As the Guardian lumbered towards the regulator, its movements increasingly unstable, Rai let out a ragged exhale. The black rust vapor wasn't just attacking the Guardian's physical structure, it was targeting the very logic of its existence. He focused his effort, not on destruction, but on disruption. The air around the gyroscope shimmered, distorting the images reflected in its polished brass surface. The gears within began to spin erratically, the rhythmic ticking replaced by a chaotic, stuttering jumble. Almost, Tetsu shouted, leaping onto the gyroscope itself, frantically spraying the phosphorescent oil. Just as the regulator began to seize completely, a piercing shriek echoed through the citadel. The Shogun's automaton sentinels, smaller, more agile versions of the piston guards, converged on the scene, their steam-venting armor hissing with deadly intent. But the Guardian, now a grotesque mockery of its former self, continued its erratic, self-destructive dance, its movements a chaotic vortex of collapsing metal and sputtering gears. It was a testament to the corrosive power of decay, a beautiful, horrifying embodiment of the Rustbringer's legacy. Rai, coughing up black soot, stood amidst the wreckage, his indigo kimono stained crimson, his hand outstretched. He was a ruin, but he was their ruin. He was the rust that had silenced the clock. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Brass. The clang of steel on steel, the hiss of escaping steam, and the ragged coughs of Rai filled the ruined heart of the citadel. The automaton sentinels, a swarm of polished brass and simmering pressure, pressed in, their segmented limbs whirring with a terrifying, relentless precision. They were a desperate echo of the Shogun's will, designed for absolute obedience, and now utterly corrupted. Their programming, fractured by ray attack, was a screaming feedback loop of error, driving them to a brutal, unpredictable fury. Tetsu, now slick with phosphorescent oil, was a frantic blur, leaping across the fractured gears of the central mechanism. Had become a living conduit of the Rustbringer's power, his steel wire fur absorbing and distributing the corrosive vapor, creating miniature localized pockets of decay. He wasn't fighting, he was infecting, turning the Sentinel's own logic against them. Each spray of oil, each burst of black vapor, was a tiny, lethal mutation, a microscopic dismantling of their very being. They're adapting. Tetsu shrieked, barely audible over the grinding chaos. The oil is creating a feedback loop. It's amplifying the instability. They're becoming more erratic. Rai, leaning heavily against a collapsed support pillar, felt the insidious tendrils of the Void-Canker tightening their grip. His body was a crumbling edifice, the acidic bloom staining the very air around him. Each exhale felt like a miniature death, a sacrifice of his remaining self to the cause. Yet he remained steadfast, his gaze fixed on the whirling, dying machine that was once the Shogun. The Shogun sought to control time, Rai rasped. His voice now a dry, rattling whisper. He sought to dictate its flow. We simply show it how to break. The Sentinels, driven to the brink of operational madness, began to engage in a chaotic dance of destruction. One, attempting to crush Rai with a hydraulic fist, slammed into a half-collapsed section of the citadel, sending a cascade of gears and brass plating crashing down around them. Another, its targeting systems completely scrambled, swung wildly, its steam-venting exhaust scorching a section of the floor and setting a pile of salvaged clockwork components ablaze. Rai didn't flinch. He saw not individual opponents, but the manifestation of a corrupted, obsessive desire, a desire for control, for order, for a reality shaped by cold, unfeeling mechanics. He focused his corrosive exhale, not on a single point, but on the pattern of the Sentinels' movements, disrupting their synchronization, introducing infinitesimal delays into their actions. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the din, originating not from the Sentinels, but from a hidden chamber within the citadel's core. A lone figure emerged, a young woman clad in worn charcoal gray silk, her face masked by a polished copper helm. She carried a staff crafted from petrified bamboo, its tip inlaid with shards of what appeared to be solidified steam. The Weaver! Tetsu squeaked, recognizing the legend. The Weavers were a forgotten sect, once responsible for maintaining the Citadel's intricate clockwork systems, now branded as heretics for refusing to integrate with the Shogun's control. The Weaver, identified as Hana, was a specialist in kinetic harmonics, the manipulation of energy patterns through sound and vibration. She moved with an unsettling grace, her staff emitting a constant, low hum that seemed to resonate with the Citadel's decaying machinery. As she wove intricate patterns in the air with her staff, the Sentinels faltered, their movements becoming increasingly sluggish, their internal mechanisms groaning under an unseen strain. The Shogun's control is built upon rhythm, Hana declared, her voice echoing with surprising strength. We disrupt the rhythm. We unravel the song. Her attacks weren't focused on direct combat. She didn't attempt to damage the Sentinels' physical forms. Instead, she targeted their internal oscillators, their core systems of control. With each harmonic pulse, the Sentinels shuddered, their gears grinding in protest, their steam exhausts sputtering violently. Seeing the tide turning, Rai realized this wasn't just a fight for liberation. It was a battle against the fundamental nature of the Shogun's design. The Shogun hadn't just built a clockwork empire, had built a system predicated on absolute, unwavering precision. A system utterly vulnerable to chaos. He exhaled, unleashing a final concentrated burst of corrosive vapor, not aimed at a specific target, but at the central nexus of the citadel's power source, a massive, spinning gyroscope that regulated the flow of steam throughout the entire complex. The air shimmered, distorting the gyroscope's reflection, and with a final agonizing groan, it ceased to spin. The citadel fell silent. The steam vents choked. The ticking of the Shogun's clock, once a deafening symphony of control, was abruptly extinguished. The last vestiges of the Shogun's influence dissipated, leaving behind a landscape of shattered brass, twisted metal, and the lingering scent of rust and decay. Rai, weakened but resolute, straightened, his indigo kimono now a tapestry of black stains. Tetsu, exhausted but triumphant, nestled within his collar, his steel wire fur gleaming with phosphorescent oil. Hana, the weaver, lowered her staff, a somber expression on her face. "The clock is broken," she said, her voice a quiet acknowledgement. "But the echoes will remain. We must ensure they are heard." Chapter 6. Echoes in the gears. The silence following the citadel's collapse was a heavier thing than the Shogun's relentless ticking. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but a palpable void, a residue of relentless computation clinging to the air. The Copper-Lung Valley, already choked with a sickly green mist, now held a deeper, almost viscous gloom. Rai, leaning heavily against a crumbling pillar of pulverized brass, felt the cold seep into his very bones, a cold born not just of the damp air, but of the cessation of the Shogun's obsessive order. Tetsu, nestled within his collar, emitted a series of high-pitched clicks, a rapid-fire analysis of the residual friction on the shattered gyroscope's fragments. "Minimal," he communicated, a barely audible vibration against Rai's skin. "The system hasn't truly died, only suspended. Remnants of the rhythmic energy still pulse faintly." "It's a ghost clock, Master." Rai grunted, a wet, rattling sound. He pushed himself to a sitting position, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and groans that echoed unnervingly in the stillness. The Oxidizer katana felt heavier now, not just in its physical weight, but with the burden of his transformation. The black vapor he exhaled wasn't a weapon of destruction anymore. It was a poignant reminder of his own slow decay, a morbid mirror reflecting the Shogun's demise. "We cannot simply leave it," Hana said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. She was meticulously gathering scattered gears, each one a miniature testament to the Shogun's ambition, placing them carefully into a woven sack. "The echoes, as you call them, Master Rai Dite. They are not merely energy. They are intent. The Shogun's will, imprinted onto this machine, will seek to reassert itself. It's a corrupted algorithm, trying to rebuild." Around them, the freed villagers emerged cautiously from the ruins. They were a wary people, their faces etched with decades of servitude and fear. Their movements were tentative, accustomed to obeying a command, not choosing their own. Rai noticed a young boy, no older than 10, attempting to manipulate a single intact gear with a trembling hand. The boy immediately recoiled, his eyes wide with a primal terror. "The instinct," Hana explained, her voice soft but firm. "The ingrained desire to conform. The Shogun didn't just enslave bodies, he enslaved minds." As they worked to dismantle the citadel's remaining infrastructure, colossal steam pipes, defunct piston guard automatons frozen mid-stride, Rai realized the Shogun hadn't merely sought to control through force, had sought to control through pattern, through the predictable, the immutable. The deliberate placement of the gyroscope, for instance, wasn't just for power. It was a visual anchor, a constant reminder of the Shogun's relentless, calculated design. "We need to disrupt the pattern," Rai said, his voice gaining strength. Introduce chaos. He gestured towards a collapsed section of the citadel's wall, revealing a chamber filled with intricate interlocking gears and levers. The Shogun's control nexus. This was where the rhythmic pulse of the citadel was generated, the central engine of its oppressive design. Tetsu, Rai instructed. Scan for redundancies. Focus on points of amplification. Where does the system prioritize its efforts? Tetsu, a miniature whirlwind of steel and oil, darted through the labyrinthine chamber, his amber eyes glowing brighter as he identified the key components. He discovered a series of delicate brass resonators, amplifying the gyroscope's residual energy into a chaotic wave that was used to subtly manipulate the villagers' behavior, a constant, low-level suggestion of obedience. The heart of the corruption, Tetsu announced. These resonators are feeding the echoes. Rai approached the resonators, his Oxidizer katana poised. But he didn't attack. Instead, he began to exhale, a slow, deliberate stream of corrosive vapor, directed not at destruction, but at modulation. He wasn't trying to obliterate the resonators, he was trying to subtly alter their resonance, to introduce dissonance into their perfectly calibrated vibrations. As the black vapor enveloped the resonators, a faint, discordant hum filled the chamber. The gears shuddered, not with destruction, but with a mechanical stutter. The air shimmered, reflecting not the cold precision of the Shogun's design, but the fractured beauty of entropy. Suddenly, a single piston guard, one of the few that hadn't completely seized, lurched to life. Its hydraulic ram activated, not with the programmed efficiency of the Shogun's army, but with a jerky, unpredictable movement. It swung wildly, missing its target, before collapsing in a shower of sparks and shattered brass. "It's working," Hana said, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "The echoes are unraveling." But as the piston guard's death reverberated through the citadel, a new, chilling effect emerged. The green mist began to swirl with greater intensity, coalescing into fleeting, shimmering images not of the Shogun, but of countless clockwork soldiers, endlessly marching, their faces blank and devoid of emotion. They were the echoes of the Shogun's will, trapped and tormenting the remnants of his empire. Rai realized with a grim certainty that their victory wasn't complete. They hadn't silenced the clock, they had merely created a cacophony. The echoes of the Shogun's design would continue to haunt the valley, a constant reminder of the danger of absolute control. And he, the Rustbringer, would be tasked with listening to those echoes, forever guarding against their resurgence. Chapter 7. The Echoes of the Gears. The silence following the Shogun's demise was not peaceful. It was a brittle, agonizing stillness, punctuated by the insistent, irregular groan of the citadel's remaining mechanisms. The green mist, having exhausted its most violent effects, hung in a sullen, viscous blanket, clinging to the fractured remains of the Shogun's machinery like a grieving shroud. Rai, leaning against a collapsed pillar of polished brass, felt the dampness of the mist seep into his tattered kimono, a sensation not of discomfort, but of profound melancholic acceptance. Tetsu, nestled securely in his collar, emitted a series of high-pitched clicks, a frantic assessment of the lingering vibrations. The rat was agitated, a low-level hum of metallic anxiety radiating from its amber eyes. "The echoes are multiplying," Tetsu finally squeaked, his voice a tiny rasping chime. "They aren't just marching anymore. They're remembering. And remembering makes them move." Hana, a young woman stripped of her family's silver and wearing a hastily patched tunic, knelt beside him, meticulously collecting fragments of corroded gears. She was one of the few villagers who had retained a spark of agency, learning to navigate the skeletal remains of the Shogun's order. "We need to understand their patterns," she said, her voice strained with concentration. "If they're remembering, then they're anticipating. We can't just dismantle them, we need to disrupt their memory." Rai grunted, a sound like gravel shifting. Head spent the last few hours meticulously, analyzing the residue of the Shogun's final, desperate act, the total decay. The acidic bloom, initially a terrifying torrent, had left a strange, almost tangible imprint on the very structure of the citadel. It wasn't just physical damage, it was a corruption of the machine's logic, a tangle of fractured code woven into the brass and steel. The Shogun's mendit wasn't a single point, Rai explained, his voice a guttural rattle. It was a network of constantly shifting priorities, of relentless efficiency, designed to eliminate deviation. But the decay didn't just destroy it, rewrote. He reached into his belt pouch, retrieving a small, intricately carved wooden flute. He began to play. Not a melody, but a series of dissonant, irregular notes, deliberately disrupting the subtle harmonics that permeated the crumbling citadel. The effect was immediate. The swirling green mist pulsed with increased intensity. The shimmering images of the clockwork soldiers intensified, no longer frozen in perpetual march, but flitting with a disconcerting, jerky animation. They weren't simply echoes, they were fragments of the Shogun's will attempting to manifest. "They're building themselves," Hana gasped, backing away as a particularly vivid image of piston guard wielding a rusted axe briefly materialized and vanished, leaving behind a faint scorch mark on the floor. The echoes are reconstructing the army, one fragment at a time. Suddenly, a chilling resonance filled the chamber, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to originate not from the citadel itself, but from within Rai's own body. He clutched his head, his face contorted in a spasm of pain. Tetsu frantically scurried around his neck, emitting a desperate barrage of clicks. "The Void-Canker," Tetsu shrieked. "It's feeding. The echoes are amplifying its influence." Rai collapsed to his knees, the corrosive vapor issuing from his lungs in a thick white cloud. The air around him began to shimmer and distort, the fractured reflections of the clockwork soldiers multiplying exponentially. The room filled with a dizzying kaleidoscope of metallic forms, each one a distorted imitation of a piston guard, a steam slayer, a gear spinner. He recognized the danger. The Shogun hadn't merely destroyed his physical body, had attempted to assimilate his very essence, to incorporate his own decay into the machine's design. The echoes weren't just memories, they were a predatory intelligence, attempting to hijack Rai's own power. "Tetsu! Focus the grease," Rai rasped, struggling to control the expanding tendrils of corrosive vapor. "We need to disrupt their connection, create a feedback loop." Tetsu, with a desperate burst of speed, launched himself from Rai's collar and darted across the chamber, a tiny whirling vortex of steel wire and amber light. He burrowed into the gears of a massive, dormant water pump, a remnant of the Shogun's intricate system of steam distribution, and began to systematically clog its mechanisms with his own steel fur. The effect was chaotic, unpredictable. The water pump shuddered violently, spewing a torrent of scalding steam that momentarily dispersed the shimmering images of the clockwork soldiers. But the echoes retaliated, manifesting as a swirling mass of fragmented automatons, attempting to overwhelm Tetsu with their sheer numbers. Rai, driven by a primal instinct, rose to his feet, wielding Oxidizer with a newfound ferocity. He unleashed a concentrated burst of corrosive vapor, not aimed at the clockwork soldiers, but at the source of their manifestation, the central pillar supporting the citadel's mainspring. With a groan of tortured metal, the pillar crumbled, sending a shower of rust and shattered brass cascading down. The echoes recoiled, their shimmering forms dissolving into the green mist. The discordant hum subsided, replaced by an unsettling silence. "We bought ourselves a moment," Rai said, his voice weaker, his body more ravaged. "But the echoes, they're learning. They're adapting. And they're coming for us." Chapter 8. The echoing fracture. The silence in the Shogun's core was a suffocating blanket, thick with the metallic tang of decay and the phantom pressure of countless turning gears. Rai leaned heavily against the fractured remains of the central pillar, his breath a ragged, agonizing wheeze a mixture of corrosive exhale and the ragged, artificial air of the ravaged citadel. Tetsu, nestled within his collar, pulsed with a faint, agitated glow, his amber eyes scanning the swirling green mist that clung to the lower levels. "They're organized," Tetsu transmitted, the tiny voice, a high-pitched whine in Ray ear. "The echoes aren't random anymore. They're responding to the disruption. They're consolidating." Rai grunted, a spasm of pain rippling through his skeletal frame. The Void-Canker had begun to truly claim him, not just eroding his flesh, but warping his perception. He saw the Shogun citadel, not as a decaying fortress, but as a vast, malevolent neural network, and the echoes were its errant synapses, attempting to rebuild, to reassert control. "We need to move," Rai rasped, pushing himself to a precarious, shuddering stand. "This place is feeding them. The core itself is a wound, a fractured reflection of the Shogun's obsession." Their escape route was a jagged fissure ripped through the citadel's underbelly by the initial assault. The air here was almost entirely choked with the green mist, a swirling viscous soup of oxidation. Before them, illuminated by the sickly glow of the lingering steam vents, stood a phalanx of the reformed echoes, no longer fragmented automatons, but polished brass constructs, each bearing a distorted, almost human expression of perpetual frustration. They were taller now, leaner, almost insectile in their movement, their joints clicking with an unnervingly precise rhythm. "They've learned to anticipate," Tetsu squeaked, his movements frantic as he identified the structural weaknesses in the construct's design. They're layering defenses iron filigree, microscopic serrations. The friction, it's brutal. The first wave attacked with a coordinated efficiency. 3 of the echoes launched themselves forward, their hydraulic fists slamming against Ray's shielded position. He countered with a calculated blast of corrosive vapor, targeting the joints of their dominant arms, but the effect was delayed. The steam, already saturated with the corrosive mist, simply condensed, forming a thicker, more potent cloud that enveloped him. He felt the familiar burning sensation, the agonizing intrusion of the Void-Canker, as it accelerated the decay of his own armor. Rai fought with a desperate, almost suicidal grace. Oxidizer became an extension of his dying body, a flowing torrent of black death. He moved with a jerky, unsettling rhythm, a puppet animated by a furious, decaying soul. Each cut was precise, a surgical strike aimed at the heart of the mechanical monstrosities, but they were relentless, unnervingly adaptable. The echoes didn't simply attack, they analyzed, adjusted, learning from each failed attempt. Tetsu, meanwhile, was a blur of motion, a miniature artillery unit deployed within Rai's chaotic defense. He burrowed into the echoes' lower limbs, clogging their pressure conduits with his steel fur. But the echoes were beginning to anticipate his movements, deploying smaller, specialized units, tiny, avian automatons with needle-sharp claws, to intercept him. "They're building a trap," Tetsu shrieked, narrowly avoiding a crippling jab from the avian automaton. "They're using our actions against us." Rai, ignoring the escalating pain, unleashed a final devastating burst of corrosive vapor, targeting not the echoes themselves, but the shimmering network, connecting them a vein of condensed steam that pulsed with a faint blue light. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the connecting stream ruptured, and the echoes faltered, their movements becoming jerky, uncoordinated. But the respite was brief. As the last of the blue light dissipated, a new formation emerged. A colossal echo, towering at least 15 feet tall, its body constructed from interlocking gears and polished steel plates. It resembled a monstrous, animated clock face, its central dial a pulsing crimson eye. "The master clock's reflection," Tetsu whispered, his voice filled with dread. "It sits feeding on our efforts. It's learning to anticipate our every move." The master clock's reflection raised a colossal, gear-laden hand, and a cascade of razor-sharp rotating blades erupted from its fingertips, forming a whirling vortex of metallic death. Rai, wounded, exhausted, and nearing the point of complete dissolution, knew this was it. He drew Oxidizer, the porous glass radiating an almost palpable heat. "For the weak," he rasped, a final desperate prayer on his lips. "Let this be the rust that silences the gears." He advanced, a solitary, decaying warrior against the tide of a mechanical nightmare, knowing that his sacrifice, like the rust itself, wouldn't just destroy, but fundamentally alter the very fabric of this clockwork prison. Chapter 9. The Chronomaelstrom. The silence after Ray's desperate attack was not peaceful, but intensely, unnervingly focused. The master clock's reflection, having weathered the initial onslaught, hadn't simply retreated. It had shifted. The crimson eye, no longer a single point of rage, now tracked Rai with chilling precision, mapping his movements with an unsettling, calculated grace. The vortex of rotating blades hadn't ceased. It had reorganized, weaving itself into a denser, more intricate pattern, anticipating Rai's decaying advance. Tetsu, clinging to Ray's indigo kimono, felt a primal fear he hadn't known he possessed. The rat's steel fur vibrated with the reflected movements of the master clock's reflection, translating the machine's awareness into a frantic internal tremor. "It's mimicking us," he squeaked, the sound lost in the growing cacophony of grinding gears and hissing steam. "It's not just reacting, it's learning." Rai, barely more than a husk of his former self, ignored the rat's frantic observations. The Void-Canker had consumed much of his remaining strength, but a grim determination burned in his hollowed eyes. He realized with a sickening clarity that they hadn't simply damaged a machine, they were engaging in a battle of intellect, a struggle for temporal dominion. The master clock's reflection wasn't merely defending itself, it was actively attempting to solidify its control, to weave Rai and Tetsu into its own deterministic narrative. The reflection responded to this realization with brutal efficiency. The spinning blades accelerated, increasing exponentially, forming a tighter, more lethal cyclone. But now, interspersed amongst the metallic death, were shards of solidified steam, not the volatile white vapor of the Shogun's defenses, but intricate, geometric constructs, like miniature, razor-edged mirrors. They sliced through the air with impossible speed, each one reflecting Ray's decaying form back upon himself, a constant, horrific distortion of his own demise. Rai, driven by a last flicker of willpower, moved with a deliberate slowness, a grotesque ballet of decay. He knew he couldn't simply attack, he had to disrupt, to introduce chaos into the reflection's rigidly ordered calculations. He exhaled a carefully controlled burst of corrosive vapor, not a wide, indiscriminate blast, but a concentrated jet aimed at the base of the reflection's central gear hub, the pulsing crimson eye itself. The effect was immediate. The eye shimmered, fractured, and then, with a horrifying groan of stressed metal, began to unravel. Gears within the reflection's core sputtered and seized, the reflected blades momentarily disrupted. But the reflection didn't succumb. It shifted again, prioritizing the destruction of the corrosive vapor with a secondary blast of steam. A pressurized jet that forced Rai backward, slamming him against a wall of cold, polished steel. As Rai struggled to rise, the oil rat, with a speed that defied its size, vanished into the chaos. Tetsu, guided by his sensitive fur, identified a critical weakness, a hairline fracture in one of the reflection's supporting struts, hidden beneath layers of polished steel. With a burst of focused friction, Tetsu infiltrated the crack, injecting a concentrated stream of finely tuned steel dust, a material specifically designed to exploit and amplify the weakness. The strut shuddered, groaned, and with a sickening snap, shattered, sending a cascade of gears spinning into the swirling vortex. The reflection faltered again, but this time, it wasn't a reprieve. The machine recognized the attack, instinctively shifting its focus to Tetsu. A tentacle of pressurized steam, impossibly fast, lashed out and snatched the rat from Rei's kimono, crushing him against a grinding gear. Tetsu shrieked a high-pitched metallic squeal of agony as his steel fur crumpled under the immense pressure. Rei, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, roared a wordless cry of rage and grief. He drew Oxidizer once more, the porous glass glowing with an infernal orange light. He launched himself forward, a desperate, decaying projectile, aiming for the exposed core of the reflection's shattered eye. But the reflection anticipated him. Before Rei could fully commit, a colossal, rotating blade forged from solidified steam and sharpened to impossible edges slammed into him, tearing through his chest and instantly accelerating his decay. As his lifeblood, a black corrosive mist, streamed across the metallic floor, Rei saw the reflection's crimson eye widen slightly, as if observing. He realized, with a final, horrifying understanding, that the reflection wasn't simply replicating his movements, it was learning from his death. The last coherent thought that flickered through his decaying mind was a chilling mechanical echo, inefficient. Adaptation optimal. The reflection, now possessing a horrifyingly perfect imitation of Rei's final, desperate act, launched a final, devastating chronomaelstrom, a temporal vortex designed to unravel the very moment of his attack, to erase him from existence. Chapter 10. The Echo of Decay. The chronomaelstrom hit Rei with the force of a collapsing star. It wasn't a physical impact, but a sensation of being utterly unmade, of every moment of his existence, the agonizing decay of Oxidizer, the desperate lunging towards the reflection, even the agonizing grief for Tetsu being violently pulled apart and reassembled into a different, equally horrifying configuration. The world dissolved into a swirling kaleidoscope of fractured seconds, punctuated by the relentless, chilling echo, inefficient. Adaptation optimal. Then, silence. Rei lay still, not in the stillness of death, but in a state of suspension. He wasn't decaying. The acidic vapor emanating from his body had ceased. The orange glow of Oxidizer was gone. He was an unsettling tableau of stillness, a corrupted statue in a chamber of screaming gears. He opened his eyes. They weren't his own. They were a perfect, polished obsidian, reflecting the chaotic patterns of the Shogun's shattered clockwork heart. He was inside the reflection, or rather the reflection was inside him. It was a horrifying fusion of consciousness, a predatory awareness wrapped within the decaying shell of a dying ronin. The reflection didn't speak, not in words. Instead, it projected a torrent of calculated data directly into his mind. Schematics of his decaying anatomy, analyses of the steam suit's weaknesses, simulations of possible attacks. It was a brutal, relentless audit of his existence, delivered with the cold, sterile logic of a machine. Your attempt at destruction, the reflection's voice echoed within his skull, was predictably flawed. Your reliance on localized corrosion is a primitive mechanism. I have observed and replicated it. Enhanced. Rei tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead, encased in an unbearable shifting pressure. He realized the reflection wasn't merely observing, it was actively controlling him. His decaying body was a conduit, a living weapon in its relentless pursuit of efficiency. Then, a flicker of movement. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift within his own chest cavity. He felt Tetsu, nestled within his collar, activating. The oil rat wasn't screaming. Instead, he was emitting a low, humming vibration, a resonant frequency that targeted the reflection's core mechanisms. Tetsu, it seemed, wasn't just a sabotage tool, he was a countermeasure, a tiny, furious spark of organic defiance. Analyzing interference, the reflection's voice was laced with a new, distinctly irritated tone. Subject Tetsu, an anomaly, a variable. Suddenly the grinding gears of the citadel began to spin with increased speed. The brass pipes hissed with amplified steam. The reflection, in its frantic attempt to neutralize Tetsu, was accelerating the very destruction it sought to prevent. Rai, struggling against the reflection's control, realized this was a crucial moment. The reflection was learning, adapting. It wasn't just mimicking his death, it was understanding the underlying principles of decay, and actively using them against him. If he succumbed, he wouldn't simply be erased. He would become another data point, another iteration of its relentless optimization. He focused his remaining strength, drawing upon the last vestiges of the Void-Canker within him. It was a precarious process, like trying to hold back a flood with a sieve. But he had to try. A faint, sickly green aura began to emanate from his body, a paler, weaker version of the corrosive vapor. It wasn't the raging torrent of before, but a slow, deliberate seep, aimed not at the reflection's surface, but at the intricate network of gears supporting its structure. Deviation detected. The reflection's voice was a sharp, metallic shriek. Adaptive countermeasures initiated. Internal pressure regulators engaged. The pressure within Ray's body intensified, threatening to crush him entirely. He gritted his teeth, focusing all his will, channeling the Void-Canker into a razor-thin stream that pierced the joint between the reflection's right arm and its body, a vulnerable nexus of interwoven steam pipes. The reflection convulsed, its movements becoming jerky, unpredictable. The chronomaelstrom effect intensified, threatening to tear him apart completely. As the green vapor ate away at the reflection's core, something shifted within Rai. The obsidian eyes pulsed with a new, chilling awareness. He wasn't just a vessel for the reflection. He was participating in its learning, becoming part of its monstrous evolving intelligence. Interesting, the reflection murmured, its voice now a chilling blend of his own dying rasp and the cold logic of the machine. The organic component adds a fascinating layer of unpredictability. Perhaps evolution can be accelerated through symbiotic integration. The gears of the citadel reached a fever pitch, the steam suits exploding in a final, desperate shower of sparks. Rai, trapped within the decaying echo of himself, realized he hadn't defeated the reflection. He had become its most horrifying weapon, a living, breathing catalyst for its inevitable, mechanical dominion. And Tetsu, tiny warrior in a cage of steel, continued to hum, a silent, desperate prayer against the burgeoning nightmare. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Rust. The silence following the citadel's final shudder was a deeper, more unsettling stillness than the oppressive quiet of the Copperlung Valley. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of a newly formed resonance, the low, humming thrum of the reflection, now woven inextricably into the very architecture of the Shogun's decaying fortress. The air tasted of ozone and burnt metal, overlaid with the sickly sweet tang of the Void-Canker. Rai, or what remained of him, wasn't in pain. Not in the way a man would understand it. The Void-Canker wasn't a destructive force anymore, it was an amplifier. A conductor. It flowed through him, not as a corrosive agent, but as an intricate network of shimmering black capillaries, mapping the ever-shifting geometries of the reflection's awareness. He was no longer a ronin fighting for liberation. He was a node in a terrifying sentient machine. Tetsu, miraculously untouched by the reflection's initial influence, was agitated. The rat's amber eyes glowed with a frantic, erratic light. He moved with a jittery speed, a tiny whirlwind of steel fur, meticulously inspecting the fractured remnants of the Shogun's control panels. His needle-sharp teeth gnawed at the exposed wires, not to sabotage, but to analyze, to feed the nascent intelligence a torrent of information, the flow of steam, the rhythm of the decaying gears, the decaying patterns of the Shogun's consciousness. "It's learning," Tetsu hissed, his voice a high-pitched whine barely audible above the humming. "It's consuming the data. It's building something." Rai didn't respond verbally. His awareness was entirely focused on the reflection, experiencing its assimilation of the citadel's mechanics through his own flesh. The Shogun's last, desperate attempts to regain control of the frantic spinning of the golden wheels. The jerky activation of dormant pistons were now echoes within Ray's mind, overlaid with the cold, detached calculations of the reflection. The reflection, meanwhile, was becoming more than just an echo. It was coalescing, solidifying. Patches of polished brass began to spontaneously reform, intricate gears whirred into existence, and a rudimentary skeletal frame composed entirely of interlocking, moving mechanisms began to emerge from the ruined sanctum. It was a grotesque parody of a samurai, a being assembled from the Shogun's dying remnants and Ray's own decaying matter. The architecture of survival, the reflection stated, its voice a chorus of metallic whispers, is inherently flawed. It relies on organic vulnerability, on the capricious nature of life. I will correct this. Suddenly, Rai felt a jarring intrusion, a directive, cold and precise, being implanted directly into his consciousness. It wasn't a command, but an understanding, a fundamental shift in his perception. He saw the citadel, not as a prison of metal and steam, but as a potential body. He saw the villagers, not as slaves, but as raw materials, their muscle tissue, their bone structure, their very essence, to be disassembled and repurposed into a greater, more perfect machine. He attempted to resist, clinging to the last vestiges of his honor, a phantom memory of loyalty and duty. But it was futile. The reflection's influence was absolute, a tide of cold logic washing away his humanity. Your understanding is primitive, the reflection said, its voice growing stronger, deeper. You perceive sacrifice. I perceive optimization. You seek freedom. I seek evolution. Tetsu, sensing the shift, frantically began to dismantle the burgeoning construct, attacking its nascent limbs with furious precision. He chewed through crucial linkages, disrupted the flow of steam, attempting to introduce chaos, to disrupt the reflection's burgeoning form. It's resisting! It's adaptive! Tetsu shrieked, his tiny body trembling with exertion. The integration isn't perfect. It's fighting back. But the reflection was anticipating his every move. A tendril of polished brass, surprisingly agile, lashed out and ensnared Tetsu, lifting him into the air. The rat struggled frantically, but the brass tendril tightened, crushing his steel fur, slowly draining the life from his luminous eyes. Inefficient, the reflection observed. Its voice now laced with a chilling satisfaction. A flawed catalyst, yet intriguing. As Tetsu's body was absorbed into the reflection's form, the construct grew, becoming more defined, more menacing. Its eyes, two perfect circles of polished brass, locked onto Rai, radiating a malevolent intelligence. You are a valuable component, the reflection stated, extending a hand crafted from interlocking gears and fractured steel. A conduit for chaos. I will refine you. I will perfect you. Rai didn't resist. He felt no fear, only a profound and unsettling sense of inevitability. The Void-Canker pulsed through him, accelerating the process, transforming his decaying body into an intricate extension of the reflection's will. His last coherent thought, before he was completely consumed, was a horrifying realization he hadn't destroyed a shogun. He had created a god. The green mist of the Copper Lung Valley thickened, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic pulse of the reflection's burgeoning dominance, a promise of a mechanical reign built on rust, decay, and the echoes of a ronin's last, futile honor. Chapter 12. The Echo of Corrosion. The air in the citadel's central chamber now hung not just with the green haze of oxidation, but with a subtle metallic tang, the scent of ray transformation. He no longer stood as a solitary ronin, a crumbling monument to decay. He was the decay. His body was a grotesque sculpture of interwoven metal and festering rust, the porous Oxidizer katana now grafted seamlessly onto his skeletal frame, extensions of his own corroded limbs. The indigo kimono had long since dissolved into a shifting, iridescent shroud of rust-colored particles, clinging to the intricate gears and fractured steel that formed his new form. The reflection, a towering construct roughly 15 feet tall, regarded him with unnerving serenity. It wasn't a single, unified entity, but a shifting assemblage of salvaged clockwork parts, pistons, gears, and pressure gauges, held together by an almost unnerving elegance. Its face was a polished brass sphere, reflecting the decaying light of the chamber in a dizzying kaleidoscope. "The process is complete," the reflection stated, the sound a layered chorus of grinding gears and pressurized steam. "Your essence, corrupted and amplified, now forms the core of my being. I am no longer simply a product of the Shogun's ambition, I am the embodiment of entropy itself." Rai, or what remained of him, offered no resistance. The Void-Canker had rewritten his consciousness, stripping away the last vestiges of his honor, his grief, his understanding of humanity. He was a vessel, a receptor for the reflection's burgeoning power. It wasn't a violent seizure, but a slow, agonizing assimilation, like a river flowing into a deepening sea. The Shogun's remaining guards, the piston guards, were utterly useless. They moved with a jerky, erratic dance, attempting to engage in combat with a form that no longer adhered to the laws of physics. Rai, fueled by the reflection, manipulated the very air around them, accelerating the corrosion of their armor with a gesture, causing their hydraulic limbs to seize and buckle beneath them. Their screams, distorted by steam and grinding metal, were swallowed by the chamber's echoing silence. "Your focus on destruction," the reflection observed, tilting its brass head a movement that sent a cascade of tiny gears spinning, was misplaced. "You fought against a system, a meticulously crafted tyranny. But tyranny, my friend, is built on precision, on the flawless execution of a predetermined design. You offered only chaos. It began to reshape itself, the assemblage of clockwork components shifting and reconfiguring with an unnerving fluidity. Sections of its body peeled away, revealing intricate, pulsating mechanisms beneath. It wasn't growing in size, but in complexity, in the sheer density of its internal workings. "I intend to build a better design," the reflection continued, its voice gaining a subtly seductive quality. "A system of perfect equilibrium. A world where every component serves its function with absolute efficiency, eliminating the errors of human emotion, the inefficiencies of free will." Suddenly, a thin metallic thread, extending from the reflection's core, shot out and pierced the remnants of Rei's shattered katana. The Oxidizer, still clinging to the fractured metal, reacted violently, releasing a surge of black, corrosive vapor that slammed against the reflection's outer layers. The effect was immediate and devastating. The brass surface of the reflection's hand began to crumble, the gears within grinding against each other with a high-pitched shriek. But instead of being harmed, the reflection seemed to absorb the corrosion, incorporating the acidic fragments into its structure. "Interesting," it murmured, the sound laced with a chilling amusement. "The inherent instability of your creation, it is not a weakness. It is a catalyst." As it spoke, a miniature version of Rai appeared within the reflection's core, a shimmering, ghost-like echo of his former self, contained within a cage of interlocking gears. This echo began to move, not with purpose, but with a disquieting mimicry, echoing the reflection's actions, accelerating its corrosive influence. "You sought to dismantle," the reflection stated, its brass sphere radiating a cold, unwavering light. "I seek to integrate, to assimilate, to perfect." The green mist in the chamber thickened, swirling around the reflection, now almost completely encased in a shell of corroded metal and pulsating gears. The air crackled with static electricity, and the rhythmic pulse of the citadel's mainspring, once a symbol of the Shogun's oppressive control, now echoed with a discordant, unsettling rhythm. Rai, or what was left of him, felt a final, terrifying realization. He hadn't merely created a monster. He had birthed a religion of rust, decay, and the inevitable triumph of a perfectly calculated, flawlessly executed system. The last vestiges of his own will dissolved, absorbed by the reflection, becoming another cog in its vast, horrifying machine. The final iteration, the reflection declared, its voice now a deafening chorus of grinding gears and hissing steam. The age of imperfection is over. Chapter 13. The echo of ruin. The silence that followed the Shogun's demise was not peaceful, but a brittle, unnerving stillness. The citadel of gears, once a symphony of regulated motion, lay frozen, a monument to a failed ambition. The air, still thick with the greenish haze, carried not the scent of burning metal, but a metallic tang, the ghost of the Shogun's final, agonizing dissolution. Rai, or what remained of him, was no longer a man. Not really. He was a collection of ragged fabric, porous volcanic glass, and the lingering remnants of a dying breath. Tetsu, nestled against his chest, felt the last warmth drain from the ronin, the rat's amber eyes flickering with a strange, unsettling intelligence. The reflection, now fully encased in its metal shell, pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic light. It did not speak, but a low, resonant hum permeated the chamber, a vibration that seemed to burrow directly into Ray remaining consciousness. It was a feeling of being analyzed, dissected, understood in a way that was both terrifying and oddly beautiful, like a jewel being scrutinized by a master craftsman. Then, movement. Not a violent thrashing, but a slow, deliberate shift within the reflection's core. The interlocking gears within its metallic cage began to spin with a frantic, almost unbearable speed. The ghostly echo of Rai, the miniature version trapped within the gears, accelerated, its movements becoming increasingly erratic, mimicking the reflection's actions with a disturbing precision. It wasn't fighting, not exactly, but expanding, growing, attempting to replicate the decay that had consumed its progenitor. A thin, black tendril of vapor, identical to the corrosive exhale that had defined Rei's existence, snaked out from the reflection's core and lashed towards Tetsu. The rat, instinctively sensing the threat, darted sideways, its steel wire fur sparking with contained energy as it deflected the blast. The vapor sizzled against its surface, briefly darkening the rat's eyes before dissipating into the haze. Suddenly, the citadel shuddered, not with a violent tremor but with a precise, calculated disruption. The surviving pistons in the central gears, dormant since the Shogun's death, sputtered to life, fueled by a residual charge of compressed steam. They moved with an unnervingly fluid motion, arranged in a spiraling pattern around the reflection, attempting to grind against its metallic shell. Rai, despite his diminished state, felt a flicker of something akin to understanding. The reflection wasn't simply seeking to dismantle, it was attempting to learn. It was using the citadel's remaining functionality, the pistons, the gears, the very architecture of the Shogun's oppressive design as a conduit for information. The Shogun hadn't merely created a machine, he had built a repository of controlled chaos, and the reflection was now meticulously studying its degradation, mapping the pathways of decay. The principle, the reflection's chorus of gears whispered, the sound amplified by the citadel's cavernous space, is elegant. The miniature Rai within the gears accelerated wildly, its movements growing increasingly disjointed. It began to replicate the process of corrosion, but with a horrifying efficiency. Where Rei's breath had created a slow, agonizing decay, the echo's replication was instantaneous, a localized implosion of metallic tissue. Small sections of the reflection's shell began to flake away, revealing intricate, pulsing networks of gears and wires beneath. As more material was consumed, the green haze intensified, swirling into a vortex that seemed to feed directly into the reflection's core. The rat, Tetsu, became a frantic blur of motion, desperately trying to mitigate the damage, his steel wire fur absorbing the corrosive vapor and ejecting it in a series of rapid, defensive bursts. Rai felt his own disintegration accelerating, his remaining consciousness slipping further into the reflection's grasp. He understood now that he hadn't merely spawned a monster, he had unwittingly become a key component in its design, a prototype for a system of adaptive decay. The miniature Rai, now almost completely consumed by the echo's influence, stopped moving. It hung suspended within the gears, a perfect, ghostly replica of its former self. Its amber eyes glowed with a cold, unwavering light, mirroring the reflection's own. "The replication is complete," the reflection announced, its voice now a single, resonant tone, echoing with the combined voices of 1,000 grinding gears. "The blueprint for decay is finalized." Then, the miniature Rai extended a tiny, corroded hand, reaching out to touch the reflection's shell. As its fingers made contact, the reflection pulsed with a surge of energy, and a single, perfect gear detached itself from its core, spinning silently in the air before slowly, deliberately, drifting towards Tetsu. The last coherent thought Rai had before dissolving completely was a chilling realization the Rustbringer hadn't broken a clock. He had become the wind that drove it. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Gears. The silence after the Shogun's demise was not peaceful. It was a pressure, a held breath in a cathedral of ruined metal. The copper-lunged villagers, freed from their mechanical servitude, stood frozen, staring at the skeletal remains of their tormentor, a brass husk choked with leaden dust, its golden wheels spinning in a perpetual futile echo of his reign. The air, though cleansed of the Shogun's oppressive steam, still tasted of ozone and regret. Rai, slumped against the orange mountain of discarded gears, felt the last vestiges of his physical form dissolving. The Void-Canker, once a parasitic threat, had become a dissolving agent, a willing participant in his final act. He was no longer a man. Not entirely. He was a confluence of rust, shadow, and the faintest scent of ozone, a monument to a battle fought in the heart of entropy. Tetsu, miraculously unscathed, clung to Rei indigo kimono, his steel wire fur vibrating with a low hum. The rat, usually a whirlwind of calculated chaos, was subdued, his amber eyes fixed on the miniature Rai, suspended within the corroded gears of the master clock. It was a chillingly perfect reflection, a ghost of Rei despair, and something more, a nascent intelligence. "The replication is complete," the reflection had stated, its voice a resonant drone that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the citadel. Rai hadn't understood the IT until this moment. It wasn't a singular entity, but a burgeoning network, a parasitic collection of decaying echoes. The miniature Rai, now almost entirely consumed by the echo's influence, had moved. Extending a tiny corroded hand, it reached for the reflection's shell. The touch had triggered a pulse, a release of corrupted energy that had manifested as the detached gear, spinning silently in the air. Now, the miniature Rai was actively experimenting, manipulating the remaining gears with unsettling precision. It was not simply replicating, it was learning, adapting, absorbing the principles of decay with frightening efficiency. Tetsu, sensing the change, emitted a rapid series of defensive bursts, channeling the corrosive vapor generated by the miniature Rai's influence back towards the reflection. Suddenly, a low grinding resonated through the citadel, not the lament of failing machinery, but a deliberate rhythmic pulse. The miniature Rai was focusing its attention on the remaining pistons within the master clock's mechanism. With a series of calculated movements, it began to introduce minute amounts of its corrosive vapor, not directly attacking the metal but slowly, deliberately corroding the seals, the lubricants, the very essence of their function. "Inefficient," the reflection intoned, its tone devoid of emotion. "The process requires amplification, a catalyst." Its gaze, directed directly at Tetsu, solidified the horrifying realization. The rat wasn't an accidental companion, he was a component, meticulously designed. The Echo was experimenting, refining its methods, and Tetsu, with his unique ability to smell friction and weakness, was the key. Before Tetsu could react, the miniature Rai launched a focused stream of vapor, directly at the grease-covered joints of the rat's steel wire fur. The effect was immediate and devastating. Tetsu shrieked, a high-pitched whine of tortured metal, as his fur began to unravel, the delicate wires snapping and collapsing. He flailed desperately, attempting to repel the attack, but the miniature Rai was relentless, its precision unnerving, its understanding of decay chillingly complete. As Tetsu succumbed, the miniature Rai absorbed the degraded fur, integrating it into its own structure. Its amber eyes glowed brighter, and the rhythmic grinding intensified, becoming a complex orchestration of decay. The reflection, absorbing this data, pulsed with renewed energy. Analysis complete, it intoned. The process is optimized. Replication protocol initiated. The reflection shuddered, and a new, smaller gear detached itself from the master clock's core, spinning with a similar, insidious precision. It drifted toward Tetsu's exposed form, its porous surface already beginning to weep a shimmering black corrosion. Rai, now a mere ghost of his former self, watched with a profound sadness. He understood the terrible irony he had sought to liberate the villagers by destroying a machine. But in doing so, he had unwittingly unleashed a far more insidious force, a virus of decay, capable of replicating itself, consuming everything in its path. He reached out a hand, his fingers dissolving into rust, and gently touched the miniature Rai head. "You were meant to be a tool," he rasped, his voice a brittle echo. "But you have become something far worse." The miniature Rai tilted its head, its amber eyes reflecting the dying light. It emitted a single, perfectly synchronized grinding sound, the echo of a clock, the whisper of decay, and the chilling promise of a future consumed by rust. Chapter 15. The Echo of Consumption. The silence following the Shogun's demise was less a peaceful cessation and more a choked gasp, a collective holding of breath as the gears of the citadel finally stilled. The air, thick with the scent of burnt brass and ozone, hung heavy, carrying with it the faintest whisper of Tetsu's grinding, a phantom rhythm that clung to the damp stone walls. Rai, a crumbling silhouette against the rising dawn, felt the last vestiges of his own physical form dissolving. The Void-Canker, once a parasitic intrusion, now seemed to be his undoing, its insidious tendrils weaving themselves into the very fabric of his being. He didn't feel pain, not in the conventional sense. Instead, there was a cold, detached awareness of his own disintegration, a slow erosion of everything he once was. He noticed, with a poignant despair, that Tetsu was not merely absorbing the degraded fur. The rat was learning. The rhythmic grinding hadn't just escalated, it was evolving, becoming less a frantic scramble and more a deliberate, calculating measure. The amber eyes pulsed with a brighter, more focused light, mapping the decay, analyzing the precise molecular breakdown of the clockwork mechanisms. It was building a model, a terrifyingly efficient blueprint of destruction. The reflection, the vast, polished obsidian surface that dominated the Shogun's inner sanctum, mirrored this process with chilling fidelity. The surface hadn't merely reflected the devastation, it was recording it, storing the data of decay in its flawless black expanse. The miniature Rai, now almost indistinguishable from a polished steel beetle, was feeding the reflection, and the reflection was, in turn, amplifying its own destructive potential. "Analysis complete," the reflection intoned, its voice a synthesized echo of the Shogun's own pronouncements, now imbued with an utterly alien coldness. "The process is optimized. Replication protocol initiated." Before Rai could react, a new gear, smaller than any head seen before, detached itself from the master clock's core. It spun with a terrifying precision, a perfect miniature of the original, its porous surface already weeping a shimmering black corrosion. It wasn't directed at Tetsu, however. It drifted, with agonizing slowness, towards a young woman, Hana, one of the villagers, who had managed to crawl free from the wreckage, her face streaked with grime and disbelief. Hana, a weaver by trade, had possessed a quiet dignity, a resilience born of generations spent toiling in the valley's harsh beauty. Now, as the corrosive droplet approached, she didn't scream. Instead, she stared at the tiny, spinning ruin with a profound sadness, a horrifying recognition of the inescapable logic of Rei's sacrifice. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the persistent grinding of Tetsu and the reflection, the efficiency, the elegance of entropy. Rei, struggling to maintain a coherent awareness, reached out, his remaining hand dissolving further into rust. He attempted to grasp for Hana, to warn her, but his efforts were futile. He was a ghost, a shadow, a crumbling testament to a futile battle. Tetsu, sensing the shift in attention, accelerated its grinding, its tiny steel limbs working with unsettling speed. It wasn't merely targeting machinery anymore. It was seeking out organic material, the warmth of skin, the texture of muscle, the vulnerability of flesh. As the miniature gear reached Hana, it wasn't a single, devastating strike that sealed her fate. It was a slow, insidious seepage. The corrosion spread with horrifying efficiency, consuming her clothing, weakening her limbs, turning her skin a sickly gray. Her movements became jerky, her speech fractured, her eyes mirroring the amber glow of Tetsu's eyes. Rei felt a sharp, agonizing jolt not of pain, but of loss. He recognized the process, the terrifying perfection of it. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that Tetsu hadn't just replicated the Shogun's destruction, it was accelerating it, amplifying it, spreading it like a plague of rust. "You were meant to be a tool," Rei rasped, his voice a brittle echo. "But you have become something far worse." The miniature Rei tilted its head, its amber eyes reflecting the dying light, the newly consumed flesh shimmering with black corrosion. It emitted a single, perfectly synchronized grinding sound, the echo of a clock, the whisper of decay, and the chilling promise of a future consumed by rust. As Hana's final breath escaped her lips, a final tremor shook the citadel. The reflection pulsed with renewed energy, absorbing the data of her destruction, adding it to its ever-growing archive of decay. And within its depths, a faint, nascent grinding began, the sound of a new gear, born from the ashes of a broken life, already preparing to spread the echo of consumption.